Ambassador Kate Foster of the UK and US Judge d'Affaires, Colleen Crenwelge. Thank you so much for joining us for this joint interview at Goobjoog Television. My name is Abdelaziz Gurbiye. The questions will be common for both of you, while others will be specific. We can proceed right now if you are comfortable. Yes. It is a year now since the term of the current parliament expired, and the elections have suffered multiple delays. The international community has hardly taken a firm position beside statements to press for completion of the elections. What steps are the UK and the US considering to ensure this long-running exercise is concluded?
For months now, we've engaged consistently with all stakeholders, with the President, with the Prime Minister, with the federal member state presidents, with members of the opposition, with civil society leaders and others, both publicly and privately, both bilaterally and jointly, to urge the timely conclusion of inclusive, transparent and credible elections. We emphasize those points and will continue to press all parties to abide by existing agreements and swiftly conclude elections that ultimately are acceptable to the Somali people and election stakeholders. And in addition to that engagement, we're providing funding. To date, we, the United States, have contributed more than $2.5 million to a basket fund, let's call it, that is run by the UN. And we're considering providing additional funding to fill an outstanding gap that was identified by the Office of the Prime Minister. We're partnering with the UK and with Norway to consider that additional funding, and we'll provide that support if we see meaningful progress in the House of the People elections and full transparency in the collection and use of candidate registration fees. Now, it's important to note that at this time, funding should not be a constraint. There is enough money on hand from the United States and other donors and from the federal government itself to conclude a significant portion of the House of the People elections.
So yeah, I absolutely want to agree. We have consistently engaged with all the key stakeholders over the past months, both publicly and privately. But I also just want to reiterate why this is important. So every Somali that I talk to tells me how deeply frustrated they are with the delays to the process. And I think we share that concern. And primarily that's because it means that there is lots of attention from ourselves as donors in the international community and the government and at federal member state level that is focused on the elections, and it is distracted from dealing with the significant needs of the Somali population. As we know, last week the Prime Minister declared a state of emergency draft, and there are many challenges that people are facing in the fight against al-Shabaab. So it is for this reason and in the interest of the Somali people that we're able to move forward with elections so that we can focus on these key issues. So that can't be about what is in our best interests, and I think as the political leaders continue this process over the coming weeks and months, that they continue to think about what is in the interests of the Somali people, and that the progress is able to move forward so we can continue the important development and support work for people.
Goobjoog News investigations revealed that 48% of the upper house candidates withdrew from the race. Despite this gross shortcoming, key financiers of the election, including the UK and the US, have remained quiet. How do you respond to concerns that the international community is aiding election irregularities by failing to speak out?
Thank you. Well, I regularly get challenged for speaking out too much, but I'm very happy to be challenged on this point. So on a regular basis, we speak with the key stakeholders, and we do that through a combination of private engagement, but we also do that publicly, and that's the reason, part of the reason for talking to you and having this conversation today. I think we have been very clear in our conversations with federal member state presidents, and both of us have spoken with all federal member state presidents over the course of the last week, talking about concerns about transparency, around credibility, and around the speed of the election. So we will continue to do that and continue to use our voice. On funding specifically, you're right, the UK, the US and a wider group of international donors have provided funding to the elections. We're considering providing additional funding, and along with the US and Norwegian counterparts, we have made clear that that funding is conditional on certain financial transparency requirements being met. So for us, as we can influence the election specifically through the resources we're providing, we're ensuring that that conditionality is in place. I think finally I would say that there will be challenges in this process. We recognise that, and I think what is important is where that is the case, that we urge parties to use the mechanisms that have been established, so such as the election dispute resolution mechanism, and that they formally lodge their complaints through those mechanisms that exist.
Will you add, or I continue? Is that enough?
I'll add, but yeah, we have in fact spoken out publicly and privately, as Ambassador Foster mentioned, and we've engaged with the key stakeholders and will continue to do that. We understand that there are concerns about the way the process has been conducted, and just recently, in fact, on November 26th, we and our international partners issued a statement calling for credibility and transparency in all electoral processes, and we highlighted in that statement some of the concerns we're hearing, and we know that that many Somali political leaders have seen that statement, and we are hopeful that they'll take on board the concerns that we and others have raised.
Lower house elections have started in some regions, but obviously, since the selection of the delegates has not been made public, what is your take on concerns these elections will totally fail the transparency test?
Well, you know, as we've mentioned a couple of times now, we have pushed all stakeholders, publicly and privately, sometimes on a bilateral basis, sometimes in partnership with Somalia's international donors. We've pushed and pushed and pushed for the rapid conclusion of transparent, credible and inclusive elections. We've shared concerns about the process with Somalia's federal and state leaders, and we'll continue to do so. And we'll stress the need to conclude elections as swiftly as possible that ultimately are acceptable to the Somali people and election stakeholders. Through the U.S. Agency for International Development, we in the United States government also are promoting transparency by supporting election observation. We are supporting a coalition of 7 Somali civil society organizations who have been able to observe the upper house process. We've trained 60 observers, half of them women, and they've been able to visit polling stations, observe voting, and meet with traditional elders, candidates, security forces, and others. And they issued a public statement on November 16th noting weaknesses in the upper house process where they observed them. So we'll call attention to that statement and continue to raise concerns about the way the process is being conducted.
And I think I just want to reiterate the point about the extent to which we and partners are pushing for transparency in the election, and as you have raised, that there are concerns in the process. As we have talked about publicly already, it is important that candidates who are verified are able to stand and compete for seats. Candidates should know who the delegates are, so they are able to talk to them prior to their seat election being held. And candidates should know when the timing of their seats are going to be scheduled. Those are points that we very much raise consistently with the key stakeholders in the political process, and we're very much committed to continuing to push on those issues.
The UK and the US have variously called for peaceful election, but the outcome of these elections could breed violence. Don't you think it is also prudent to advocate for credibility to avert post-election violence?
So in short, yes, absolutely. If you look at closely at our public statements, we are advocating both for credibility and for peaceful elections. And I would say that those two issues go hand in hand. If you don't have a credible process, you are more likely to lead to conflict. And it is something that I think is incumbent on the leaders of this country to ensure that we don't see a repeat of some of the violence that we saw earlier this year and the large displacement of tens of thousands of people from their homes as a consequences of that. So the international community on the 26th of November specifically talked to the importance of the credibility of the election process, as well as the need for transparency. The UK and the US were both signatories of that statement, but so were a further 20 bilateral partners, important partners of Somalia, as well as a series of multilateral partners such as the AU, the UN, the EU and IGAD. So we're all very clear about the importance that we place on this issue and the extent to which we will continue to pay attention and to advocate for it.
Absolutely. I mean, the international community, I think, has been united on this point in calling for credibility and in encouraging all parties, all stakeholders to avoid violence. It is critical that that be the case. No one wants to see, I think, a repeat of what happened earlier this year. And as Ambassador Foster said, credibility, it goes hand in hand with avoiding violence. We'll continue to push these points.
Presidential candidates has suggested it will be taken further steps, including the formation of new government, and that they will not recognize the outcome of the elections in light of the electoral delays and the mass irregularities in the election. Could you speak out on this development, please?
Yeah, we've consistently urged all parties to abide by existing consensus-based agreements and swiftly conclude elections that ultimately are acceptable to all stakeholders, and we'll continue to make that point. We'll also stress the need, again, publicly and privately, and in partnership often with Somalia's supporters, that any conflicts that might arise or emerge should be resolved through peaceful means and should be resolved through dialogue. No one should want to see violence.
And I think additionally, if you look back historically in Somalia, the frameworks that have kept the country moving forward and avoiding violence have been the politically agreed frameworks which have been done on a consensus basis. So I think at the moment we would continue to urge all key stakeholders to respect those consensus-based, mutually agreed frameworks that are in place. And where there are issues, and there will be, we recognise that they raise them. Those are raised through the formal mechanisms that are in place to address those problems.
Is it practical to stop this so-called low house election to start over?
I mean, I think at this stage we would continue to urge the process to move forward, but as we have talked about, it is critical that a certain number of elements are respected in that process. So that plays to the transparency and credibility of the process, that plays to the fairness of which candidates who have passed the verification process are able to compete for seats, the transparency around delegate selection process is in place. I think federal member state presidents and the Prime Minister have committed to these through political agreements that were made earlier this year. And I think our role is to support the holding to account of the leaders to the agreements that they have made. And as I say, it is important where there are issues that they are raised through the formal mechanisms that have been put in place to enable those issues to be, one, transparently handled and addressed.
Absolutely. There are agreements in place, and we will continue to urge all stakeholders, the President, the Prime Minister, the federal and state leaders, to abide by those agreements and to stand by their commitments and obligations, and then conduct a process that is credible and transparent. And where there are concerns, we do think that they should be raised through established mechanisms. It is our role, in our view, to support the agreements that are in place.
As the two main donors of Somalia and direct financiers of this election, can you call directly to the FMGs, those who are blocking people to exercise their constitutional rights on behalf of Farmaajo and his regime? Why don't you call directly?
So we regularly speak to all the key stakeholders, and that's across key figures in the federal government, so the President, the Prime Minister, with the FEATs, with the federal member state presidents, with the seats, with the CPC, the opposition candidates. I think our role is to talk to everyone and to have that conversation, to hear concerns and to bring people back to the commitments and frameworks that they have agreed to and committed to. We will do that through a combination, I think, as you would expect, of private discussion and advocacy, pushing and challenging on some of the trickier issues, but also speaking out publicly when it is appropriate to do so and to amplify key messages, very much as we are doing in this conversation with you today.
We do engage broadly and regularly with those involved in this process, and we take on board concerns. We share them broadly as we converse with various individuals who are involved in implementing these elections, and we'll continue to do that. Many of these conversations take place privately, as is the custom in the kind of work we do, in the diplomacy that we do, but other conversations take place publicly as we're doing right now.
Colleen, the US signaled it will be reconsidering support for DANAP following its participation in Gur'el conflict. Are you following up on this matter? What steps, if any, will you be taking?
Our review of our support to the DANAP is ongoing. We provide training and support to the DANAP to advance our shared objective of defeating al-Shabaab, and we want to ensure our support is being used appropriately and in line with US policy. We continue to urge, speaking of the Gur'el conflict, we continue to urge Somali government authorities and al-Sunnah to engage in dialogue to peacefully resolve the conflict. I think further dialogue is necessary. We would not, under any circumstances, want to see any further fighting. That would only worsen the humanitarian situation. Already the humanitarian situation is dire. It also would distract from the critical priorities of completing the elections and fighting al-Shabaab.
Somalia is fast sliding into severe drought amid donor fatigue as aid agencies report limited funding. Could you highlight interventions the US and the UK are taking to save lives?
So firstly, I want to say this situation is deeply concerning. Back in 2011, the last time that Somalia experienced a devastating famine, I was actually working for a humanitarian agency providing on-the-ground support to Somalis who were displaced from their land and in need of food and water. So I have seen firsthand the really direct consequences of these continued failed cycles of rain. And I've heard very much over the last couple of weeks from partners from the Jubaland administration. I've seen the pictures of what's already been experienced there and the scale of livestock death. So I think we have all learned from previous crises here, particularly back in 2011, and again, some of the challenging situation that Somalia experienced in 2016, 2017, which is where we had seen a very similar pattern of failed rainfall. We know what works. That is everyone responding early to the indicators that we have seen rather than waiting until we see large numbers of death. So that's why I want to welcome the statement last week from the Prime Minister declaring the state of emergency for the drought situation. It's critical that the government is able to focus resources on it here, both at the federal level, but also in member states. I think on the part of donors, we're very much advocating within our own systems and helping to amplify the situation in Somalia globally. As you say, it is a challenging global situation and it is imperative on all of us to raise the profile of the crisis and the challenge of the months ahead. For the UK, we're working very closely with partners such as the US, such as the United Nations, to also make sure that we're refocusing some of our work here. So that's us activating crisis response mechanisms that we've got in place in many of our humanitarian programs, which were specifically developed, building on the learning from previous crises here. We're assessing how best to increase our support and how to reprioritise other programmes. And we're absolutely committed to using all of our resources, be that humanitarian funding, development funding, as well as diplomatic support and the engagement of people like myself, to really support the response here and to ensure that the needs here in Somalia are heard on the international stage.
Yeah, we share the deep concern the situation in Somalia right now. We also were pleased to see the federal government's declaration of drought. Through the US Agency for International Development and in partnership with the UK and others, UN agencies, we are trying to meet the needs of the many Somalis affected by the drought. We have several initiatives in place. We're providing emergency food assistance, including through cash transfers and vouchers. We're trucking water, providing essential health and nutrition services. And for those displaced by the drought, including to cities and other urban areas, we're prioritizing our support based on specific needs. We're very closely following the situation and are doing everything we can to meet the most pressing needs across the country. In our latest fiscal year, in the US government's latest fiscal year, as ended just last September, we had provided more than $400 million in assistance to Somalia to meet humanitarian needs. That was comprehensive assistance. We are very much making the case to Washington that additional resources potentially will be needed here in Somalia if the situation worsens, and we will continue to work with Somalia's other partners and through the UN organizations to prioritize the most immediate life-saving interventions so that we can absolutely do our part to support Somalia at this time.
Both of you, you are two very strong women. I have seen that you have worked many places like Sierra Leone, South Sudan, like even I have seen Colleen, she has gone to Pakistan, many places, crisis, dealing with crisis, humanitarian, children and everything. Tell me, what is the difference between the countries you have gone and Somalia?
Ooh, that's a good question, yeah. I mean, so I guess I have spent large parts of my career working, as you've highlighted, in other parts of Africa, often in contexts that have been a bit similar, where there has been conflict or countries emerging from conflict. So actually, there are many similarities, I think, in that, in terms of working very closely with government, with a range of partners, helping to support the strengthening of institutions. I think one of the key things in a context like here is sometimes when there is a conflict that is ongoing, you can spend a lot of your time talking about security. And I think that is definitely true here in Somalia. But yet it's important that we find enough time and space to really talk about why this matters. Security is important because it provides the pathway towards development for a country. It's the thing that allows girls and children to go to school. It is the stability that provides the opportunity for business and the private sector to come in and invest and to provide jobs and opportunities for people, and particularly the youth of Somalia. The average age here is, I think it's 35. This is the population that we need to be supporting, that need to have jobs and opportunities, and providing those positive opportunities will also be critically important in the fight against Al-Shabaab. So I think one of the things that is common actually is sometimes we fall into this trap of just focusing on some of the challenges, but don't focus on the opportunities and the pathway to support countries such as Somalia to continue to develop and create more positive opportunities for people.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I've also worked in a number of countries that are going through conflict or trying to emerge from and recover from it. And it is true that we spend a lot of time talking about security, and we are here investing a lot of money and resources in improving Somalia's security and working with our Somali partners. And it's important to be able to establish security for all the reasons that Ambassador Foster laid out. security opens the door to, or paves the way to, all these other things, these opportunities in education and in the economy, and opportunities for women and girls and marginalized groups. So it's important to focus on that, but it's important to focus as well, as Ambassador Foster said, on creating opportunity and on looking ahead at the future that Somalia wants to create for itself and for its people. And it's important across the board to be able to do that. And I've been really impressed in my time here with the entrepreneurial spirit that I've seen in many Somalis, the vibrancy, the desire for education and for opportunity. And it is our hope to be able to support that.
Finally, on the women quota, as honorable women ambassadors, what is your assessment so far, given the stiff lower house elections? Is there a hope of realizing the 30% seats of the women in the federal parliament?
So I think we're absolutely keen to see women play a greater role at every step in the political process. And as you say, we are 2 women here representing our countries, and very proud to be able to do that and to talk about these issues. And women need to be involved, in delegate selection, to the presidential poll. And I think there is a female candidate for president for the first time, which is really exciting to see, to have that female voice at that level. The leaders, Somalia's leaders, have made a commitment to this, and it is really important that they follow through and deliver on the commitment they made, and we absolutely urge them to do so. But I think it's also important to talk about why this issue matters at all. Without the empowerment and participation of women, the country stands to lose the opportunity to access skills, experience, and the voice of over 50% of the population. So economic growth, political development, improving stability needs to be and have the voice of both men and women involved at its heart in shaping that. So it's important to talk about this in the political process. It's absolutely important to talk about it also at the community and grassroots level. So I think we were disappointed to see elections in the upper house fall short of the target at around 26%. And as I say, we very much are and will continue to urge the National Consultative Council to translate the commitments that they have made and the words in the agreements they have signed into action, and to fulfill those commitments.
Right. We also were disappointed to see that the upper house elections fell short of that agreed 30% women's quota. This was a commitment that leaders had made, and we would hope that the lower house elections will produce, let's say, better results. We would like to see that 30% quota met. Again, this is a commitment that leaders have made, and we would encourage them to uphold their obligations. It is important that women participate in all elements of the electoral process, and that they participate in government and in all aspects of society. Countries are more peaceful, more stable, more prosperous, I think, if women and girls are allowed to participate fully in all aspects of society.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.